next thing anyways, so it's perfect. And I'm going to bring plants in and show you all, and they're going to be stand-ins. But essentially, this is kind of descending order from biggest to smallest. And I'm just going to go, it's trunks and leaders, that's what we call the tree stem. Scaffold branches, lateral branches, and twigs, so that goes from the biggest branches to the medium branches down to the twigs. Terminal buds, lateral buds, nodes, we'll get through all that. So, this is actually kind of, it's not embarrassing for me, it's embarrassing for somebody else, but you won't know their name. I started working in tree care in Charlottesville. There is a community college over there, and I went one night, kind of like this, with my boss, in the role that I am now, and they were talking about tree pruning. And we did like a practical show outside. I climbed a tree, we had a bucket truck there, and then my boss talked. And I sat in the very back next to the instructor, the horticulture instructor at this community college. And my boss said, if I walk up to a tree right now and put a nail in the tree, and I come back 10 years later, where's that nail going to be? Where's that nail going to be? Is it, if it's at eye level, and I come back, doesn't matter what kind of tree, and I come back 10 years later, where do you think I'm going to find that nail? It's okay, go ahead.
Inside the tree.
Eye level, inside the tree. The instructor of horticulture sat next to me. She said to herself, thank God, she's like 10, maybe 12 feet higher? I'm like, you don't understand how trees grow. You obviously don't say that, but trees do not push themselves out of the ground. They just put more tissue on the ends, and on the tips, and then on the diameter of the tree. That's why we have rings of wood. The tree does not push itself up. So that's super important. If it's not pushing itself up, and if we're making cuts on the very tips, which are the growing portions of the tree, you can really mess things up, because that's where all the growth is really occurring. So there is your tree. The one that I always mess up is suckers and water sprouts. I kind of just call them the same thing. They're all suckers to me. But you start with the stem, trunk. That goes out to scaffold limbs. Then you go to lateral limbs. When I write specifications, I call those secondaries. You have primary limbs and secondary limbs that then go down to twigs. And a lot of people hate suckers and water sprouts. There are many reasons for those. Sometimes you have genetics, like elm trees, crab apples, pears, a lot of the fruit trees. They will throw up suckers like crazy. So you'll get all these water sprouts in the interior of the canopy. Doesn't mean the tree is not healthy. It is purely just a genetic development. It's a genetic trait of the tree to put those out. It is unsightly, especially when it's for fruit production. It's bad because that limits sunlight, and growers don't like that. On some trees, it is also just a sign of stress. It's a sign that the tree is dying back, and it's just trying to put out as much growth as possible. So if you have a big old tree and it's got suckers all over the place, and you go in there every year and you strip all those suckers off the tree, you're actually probably doing more harm than good. You're taking away what that tree is doing. It's kind of like gasping for life, and unfortunately, you're cutting it all off. So it's good to know that it's not always a bad thing that you want to take off. And suckers, the only time you're going to see suckers on a stress tree is when the rest of the tree above the ground is pretty much dead. And that's just the root system trying to put new tissue out. Suckers are just mostly not genetics. There are some plants that will throw suckers up, but not much. A lot of the times we're going to see suckers in the landscape, especially the planted landscape, are going to be cultivars. One plant that I always think about is Harry Lauder's walking stick, the contorted filbert. It is essentially clonally propagated. It is a grafted plant. So you have the upper plant, and then you have the rootstock. So you have scion and rootstock, and the rootstock is just a regular filbert. It's a hazelnut, which is a very aggressive tree. So if you let that rootstock grow up, it will outgrow the actual contorted part. That's important to know what kind of plant you're dealing with, because if you don't prune those off every year, you lose your contorted filbert. Here we go. branch, bark, ridge. So the branch collar, branch, bark, ridge, all of that, this is the most important slide. Hands down, the most important slide. Because if you can't identify this, there's not a laser pointer, is there?
Nope, you were asking too much.
Okay, I can do this then. I'm sure. Nope. Back. That's laser pointer. Nice. There we go. Okay, so what a branch bark, or what a branch collar is, sorry, I'm reading, is kind of this swollen area where a branch comes out of, that's really jumpy, comes out of a tree. And it is how the tree puts new tissue on to hold that limb. So if you were to go up there and do a slice down through that wood like that and see actually a cross section of that drawing, you'd see where that branch actually almost kind of penetrates inside of the tree. And that's because that branch has been there for a while. And as new layers of tissue get put on, you end up with the branch coming out. It looks like it's kind of like jammed down inside, but it's actually just how the tree has grown new tissue on. So when we prune, we almost always want to prune back to the branch bark ridge, but not cut the branch bark ridge off, or the branch collar, I'm sorry, keep reading that. You want to always leave a branch collar intact. It's not always that close to the tree. It's not always that easy to see. And I've got some stuff I can show you that is easier to see. The branch bark ridge, and I have a beautiful chunk of wood outside that I'll show you guys. The branch bark ridge is when you have these two pieces coming together, you're going to have two options. Either there's going to be a subduction of bark and the bark kind of gets sucked down in between those two unions, or there's going to be a rising of the bark. Can anybody guess which is a stronger union? It's sucked out, bark down in, bark pushed out. Pushed out, yep. Because bark has zero holding strength. It's just there, it's like skin. We would just be a bag of ugh if we didn't have bones, right? Bark is kind of like our skin. So if it's pulled down in, it makes a really bad union, and that wood can't lock together. As it grows, bark should always be pushed out away from that union. And that's when you're looking for poorly spaced branches or poorly angled branches. If you see that subduction down in, that's a limb you want to take off, if at all possible. And then I will show you this. It's a little bit easier to understand in person, but the three-step cut. So really, this is the most important slide there is. Branch, collar, three-step cut. The three-step cut is a way to save yourself from like tearing off the branch as you're cutting it. So many people love to use gravity. Gravity's great. Put the saw on top of the branch, pull back, and it just rips right off. Easy. You only had to cut halfway through the branch. Great. You put a huge wound on the tree. By using the three-step cut, what you do is you undercut it, you back cut it, that'll snap off, and then you make a good clean cut. Only problem is you're cutting the branch 2 times, at least. So that can become a little problematic. So, what is this up here? That is the branch bark ridge. That is where the tree is pushing that bark out. So that actually was a really well-attached branch. I'm going to go slowly because I think it might actually work. This line right here, you can barely see it, is almost perfectly the branch collar. So what I tell people is when you're making a pruning cut, in a perfect world, almost all your cuts are going to be nearly circular. If you end up getting an oblong cut, that means you've probably actually cut the branch collar off. So I'm much happier seeing a little bit of wood left beyond that branch collar. I would much rather have a little bit of a stub versus cutting into the branch collar. And the reason being is you can always go back and fix it. You can take more off, you can't add it back. So that's one reason. This is an almost perfect cut though. I love that, that's why it's there. The other thing is if you cut the branch collar off, you're actually putting a bigger cut on the tree. When we have surgery, we want to do it arthroscopically now. We want to do it with the tiniest cuts possible because we heal a lot faster and there's less recovery time. Same thing with trees. The smaller the cut you can put on the tree, the faster that wound can close. And if you think about it, we want our wounds to close fast so we don't get infection. We want those wounds to close fast so you don't get decay moving down inside the tree. So you're helping the tree by putting a smaller cut. The other thing is, and I'll show this again with some other slides and also some wood I brought, is the branch collar is this natural adaptation that allows the wood or the tree to close over that wound. It's just specially developed. Trees have been doing this for millions and millions of years. It is specially developed to close over that wound, and or even a dead limb. And you'll see that with some of the stuff I brought in. So you want to maintain the branch collar at all costs. You don't want to cut the branch collar off if you can get away with it. So going too close, there's your flush cut. So if you think about this cut right here, that is very grumpy. It should be maybe a cut like that at most. What they did is I've actually seen people who try to kind of sculpt a cut to match the curvature of the tree stem and things like that. All you're doing is just putting a tremendously large wound on the, turn that off now, on the tree. So that might look kind of good depending upon your aesthetic because it's nice and smooth. It's following and especially on that second photo, it's just kind of following the nice curvature of the wood. Of the stem, but it just puts a giant hole on the tree, and it's going to or a wound on the tree. And it's going to take forever for the tree to close over that. This one's just this is one of my favorite photos because there's a perfect cut on top. That top cut is gorgeous. There's a great branch collar still remaining. It's perfectly circular, and then they just got crazy with it. My favorite part is between the bottom cut and the top cut, you see that nick? Somebody was using a chainsaw, got a little too aggressive and not only cut that branch off wrong, but they also put a big old nick in the tree. It also kind of looks like somebody came through, made a cut that might have been close to okay, and they just said, nah, I want it to look real good, and just carve the bottom off. If you come back a year from now, maybe 2 years from now, that nick will be closed, not a big deal, but there will be a scar. That upper branch, 2 years, closed, because it's got to be a red maple, and it looks like it's relatively juvenile, very aggressive grower. It's going to close over the wound with callus tissue. That bottom one, it's not going to be closed over. It might be like a quarter closed over at best. Come back 5 years from now, you're going to have a hole in the tree right there because maple is really bad at compartmentalizing, closing off wounds, closing off decay, and it is also a softwood, doesn't have a lot of those chemicals in them. Hit me.
Is there anything you can do to mediate against a bad cut?
Well, teach people, do not seal it. Never seal. There's always an exception to the rule. The rule 99% of the time, don't put sealants on. And I cut myself one time and I got this nice scar on my arm. Had a couple stitches put in and they put a bandage on my arm, right? That bandage is really important, keeps it dry and clean. Imagine if I never, ever, ever changed that bandage. I would have the worst infection of my life and I might lose my arm. That's what sealant does. Sealant will close that wound over. It creates a moist, dark, and just really protected spot. Fungus loves to eat wood. Fungus is now wet and dark, and it's back there behind that tar. You're just going to end up making things so much worse. And tar is also, they tar and feather people. Tar is not good for living things. It will actually cause cell death along the exterior of that wound. So don't seal. The only caveat is if you have, we don't have to worry about it here, but in some areas, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, there's something called oak wilt. Oak wilt's a fungal infection. If you put a fresh cut on an actively growing tree that's not dormant, you'll get disease. It's very rare that you have to worry about that. So no sealants, especially in Central Virginia. That make sense? Cool. So this is a cool picture too. Somebody made a giant stub cut. They just left a big old stub there. I would take that 100 times over the flush cut. First of all, I can come in there and make a beautiful cut. No big deal. The other reason I love this photo is look at that branch color. So that weird kind of rolling looking, like smoother looking tissue, it's also another cool part of the photo, is the branch color growing out, trying to close over that wound. And if you look at how aggressively it's growing out there, if you came back 5 years from now, the branch collar would probably have actually closed over that entire stub. But you're gonna have a big stub there. Don't come back through and cut that clean again. That's just adding insult to injury, because the thing is that branch collar is now gone. So a lot of people, if it came out and you have this like knob on your tree, people just want to cut it off because it looks bad. I kind of agree. But it's really bad for the tree because that branch collar is now gone. That branch collar has grown out and closed over, and now that's just part of the trunk. So it no longer has that genetically developed portion to close over the wound. So now it's just kind of like walking up to a tree and taking a hatchet and just cutting bark off. It's a lot slower and harder for the tree to close over that. The other reason I really pronounced branch collar. And I also really like the barbed wire inside the tree. If you can see right kind of at the crotch, it's just inside of the tree. Yes, hand.
So when I first saw that and you said I could cut that off, I thought, well, that would be looking in the tree again.
Yep, but I would cut it right there.
Because that way it can heal itself properly.
Exactly. Because remember, if you go back to the 4 Ds, dead, disease, dying, and damaged, that's dead. You can take it off whenever you want. And it's already dead. So all you're doing by cutting the rest of that off there is you're just facilitating the branch collar doing what it's supposed to do. If that person who made that cut the first time had made a perfect cut and a good cut right outside the branch collar, you wouldn't even see that wound anymore. It would pretty much close over. Perfect. Truly gorgeous. You can see by the scar that it was almost perfect cut, beautifully circular, and then you have callus tissue. Callus tissue is kind of like our scar tissue. We can take parts of our body and sew them back on and they'll graft back onto us. Pretty cool. Trees, you can't stretch the bark and put it over it. You can take donor bark, but that's really hard and actually doesn't work well for trees. So what you do is you just have callus tissue. It's that wound wood that grows over. And that's essentially where that branch collar is now growing and closing over. You come back a year or two later, that's going to be completely sealed. And then you come back 10 years later, you might be able to tell that there had been a wound there, but there's a really good chance it's just going to now be part of the trunk. That's perfect. That's what you want to see. Again, most of these, I think a lot of these photos are actually red maples because red maples are fast growing and they're really good for study. So they just work really well when you're taking photos for things like this. Okay, so we already talked about why we prune trees. I'm going to go through the 4 Ds quickly. When thinning, and this needs to be updated, thinning is no longer a thing. That's where I was talking about ANSI Z133. They've changed it. You don't thin trees anymore. You can reduce density, but tree thinning is not even really a term that's supposed to be used because it's a very vague thing. What it really comes down to from the new standpoint, the new view at pruning, is always get the dead, diseased, dying, and damaged out. No problem. Get that out of there. It's bad for the tree. When you're pruning the tree, you never want to take more than 30%, ever. It actually should be about 25%. Because leaves are food. If you take more than 25% away, the tree goes into starvation mode, and it starts setting all these suckers and water sprouts out, and it ends up either killing the tree or making the tree structurally worse worse because of that pruning, because it now is just trying to put all this growth back out. Don't feel like you have to thin trees. In my career of almost 14 years, I've thinned thousands of trees. But looking at it from the more practical standpoint, thinning is just this kind of catch-all term that we use to explain just removing stuff. It doesn't actually give a real direction for why we're removing it. You can just say it's just to kind of open the tree up, reduce wind load and things like that. That makes sense. But you actually really want to think about what every removal portion is actually accomplishing for that tree. Are you taking some tissue out of the center to improve wind flow through the tree in order to reduce storm damage? Are you trying to open it up and get tissue out for more sunlight penetration for fruit production? You actually really want to think about what the end goal is instead of just saying the tree should be, it looks dense, it should be thinner. There are a lot of reasons to thin, but I'm going to back us away from the idea of thinning for thinning's sake. Here's the thing no one ever thinks about, and it's the most important thing we can do. And I have no children, but I do have a dog, so I'll use children and dogs interchangeably here. If you have a child or a dog and you don't raise it right or train it correctly from a puppy or from a baby, you're not all of a sudden going to have like this great, stellar adult dog or adult human. You have to raise them properly in order to get something good at the end. Same thing with trees. If you let a tree, especially one that you've planted, just grow to its own devices, you're probably going to end up with a terrible tree because it's just doing whatever it wants. It's making itself happy. It doesn't care what you want. It doesn't care what the end goal is. It just goes crazy. And that's especially because we're taking trees that developed over millions of years in woods, growing up, and they're having to outcompete one another for sunlight. That's just how woods work. Well, we love to take these trees and put them right in the center of our front yard where there's just sunlight all the way around. And you get terrible structure because the tree just can do whatever it wants to do. It is no longer having to meet its genetic imperative to go up to get sunlight. It just gets to get it all the way around, and you end up with a terrible tree. So a lot of what we do as arborists and what you do as master gardeners is you train the trees back the way they're supposed to be going. And that is structural pruning, and we're going to get deep into that. And raising. I like remove lower branches for safety. That should be the best reason to do it. Can anybody guess why most people raise the limbs on their trees? Grass. Stinking grass. Go to the prairie and show me a tree that wasn't planted. Doesn't exist. Go to the woods and show me a grassy patch where a tree didn't maybe fall down 5 years ago. Doesn't exist. Trees and grass do not work in harmony very well. So a lot of raising occurs for grass. It can be done. It needs to be done in an ethical and well-thought manner. If you're taking all the low limbs off because you want golf course grass, just get rid of the tree. At that point, I just might have stopped torturing it by just like skinning it up. For safety, though, that is actually pretty important. And then heading is terrible. It's done so much. Heading, you've all heard of tree topping. Tree topping is essentially heading. It's just cutting, not really with any thought. It's to make the tree smaller, to make the tree safer. But as I said before, we're going to treat trees and shrubs the same in this talk. Think of all the shrubs we head with shears. We just buzz them. And that's just because it's probably the wrong plant in the wrong spot. Cleaning. Sorry. Cleaning, we've already talked about it. Get it out of there. And it doesn't matter, so especially when you're planting young trees, they're always like, don't prune the tree for a couple years to let it kind of get its feet underneath of it. If it's dead or it's broken, just get it off because it's dead or it's broken. I mean, it's not like it's going to help the tree. And yes, I know, so some people do say prune the tree, before you plant it in order to get a better root to shoot ratio, please don't do that. Imagine you got COVID and you're trying to recover, and somebody says you can only eat half the food you actually want to eat. You're not going to recover really fast. If you're planting a new tree, it's already stressed. Some of its roots might have been cut off. It's in a spot it doesn't really want to be. And then you take some foliage off in order to make it more balanced. You're actually starving the tree, and it's going to make it harder for the tree to recover. So don't do that. Hit me. Yep. It's lichen. So lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungi and a blue-green algae. So it's where you have a fungus, which is a heterotroph, and an algae, which is an autotroph. The algae makes food. The fungi acts as a strata for it to live and can also collect some nutrients. So it's just this really happy growth of two organisms. It's just looking for a place to live. It's not going to hurt anything. And the other thing is I've read that you actually get more lichen growth in good air quality. So if you're seeing it on your landscape, it's actually a good thing. Everything comes with a caveat. I have seen a foliose lichen on boxwoods and azaleas that have killed boxwoods and azaleas. Very rarely, like 1 in a million kind of thing. But there can be some destructive lichen. It is very rare though. And on trees like this, not a problem at all. Like I said, there's always going to be a caveat to everything I say. It's always. Okay, so hopefully you can tell that you've got the well-drawn tree, and then you have the spotty portions of the tree. I kind of wish there was a before and after for this tree, but if you look at it, imagine all that branching there at one time. It's a dense, a lot of conflicting and rubbing limbs. So if I were to write a specification about pruning that tree, what is my goal? It's to develop better tree architecture. So why am I pruning that tree? I want it to be a stronger, more architecturally developed tree. So by thinking about what I want from the tree, I can now go towards how do I get there? And that's removing limbs. I'm not going to say, you're fine. I'm going to bring 6 times 2. I'm sure. If you go through and you say thin the tree by 25% to improve light and air penetration through the canopy, it doesn't mean anything. But if I say selectively remove crossing and rubbing limbs to develop better branch spacing, you can go out there and see what needs to be done. So you need to look at that tree and think, it's too dense. How to make it less dense? I'm going to selectively take those branches out that are too dense. I think that's great. The pruning that has been accomplished, at least on the bottom down there, is beautiful just in terms of taking branches out to develop good branch structure. If you look up higher, now we have these split stems, and I'm going to harp on codominant stems like crazy, but the tree has split into 2 stems. If you go into the woods, again, where trees grew for, again, millions of years, there aren't multiple stem trees. There might be a couple where like it snapped off and regrew as multiple stems, but it's almost all single stem trees. It's because a single stem is a great way to put all your resources into getting as high as possible. A tree that branches out like that is now wasting its energy. It's putting 2 stems out instead of 1, so it's actually not growing faster. And then you end up getting these codominant stems. So that's almost always going to happen when you put a tree that's supposed to be in the woods in your front yard. You're going to get multiple stems because the tree is going out to try to get as much sunlight as it possibly can. It is a tree that is now at an all-you-can-eat buffet, and it's going to eat until it dies, literally. It's going to suck up as much sunlight as it can until it finally grows so big, and it just starts to shut down over time. That's not good for the tree because usually they just get ripped apart in storms before they die a natural death. This is going to go back to my raising your children the right way. If you essentially started out, and let's kind of pretend you started out with the exact same tree, year 1, up and down. I know they're a little bit different. and you let it grow for 10 years, and if I tried, let me pull this pointer back up. Come on, come on. There is no way in the world you could take either of these trees, wait 10 years, and take this tree and turn it into this tree with pruning. I cannot take this tree and make this tree with pruning at year 10. You have to start, and it looks like what was probably done is there was a little bit of pruning at year 1. We worked on getting rid of those codominant stems, those 2 stems up there. I'm going to put that over to the side. You've got a good single stem that's developed, and it's because the tree has been touched multiple times. I don't want any of you climbing trees. Don't climb trees. That's what we do. Falling out of a tree is not a good way to die. Don't do it. Don't get on ladders. Ladders are worse than climbing trees because they almost always kick out and you come down and break stuff. But the place you can do the most good for trees is when they're young. You prune them from the ground. You're not going to kill yourself in the process. And that tree at year 10 on the bottom is light years ahead of the tree at 10 years at the top. So while you feel like you might not be able to do as much, you look at these giant oaks around your house and think, well, these are scary. How do I fix these? Most of the time, you don't need to. You really just need to work on the smaller young trees, and you're going to develop better trees in the process. So don't be afraid to prune them a lot. That doesn't mean take a lot out. Don't be afraid to prune them frequently. I prune most of the stuff around my house once a year, but it's because it's all small stuff, and it's just easy to prune. And that way I can really, I like the hand of man pruning kind of look where I made the tree look that way. So I prune my trees a lot, frequently, not in terms of debris removal. Okay, so let's talk about tree on the left. How do we make that a good tree? Through pruning, what can we do? Give me some stuff that if you walked up to that tree, and first of all, I'm going to give you a goal. I'm going to give you an objective. I want to improve the appearance of the tree. I want it to look a little prettier, and I want to develop a stronger tree structure or architecture. What would you all do if I gave you those objectives? What do you think we should do there to make that tree nice? You shout it out, you're fine. Okay, bottom right. Yep. So we're talking about, would we cut just that? I mean, we're not worried about proper cuts right now. We're worried about what we're just taking off. Take it off all the way back to the stem? Okay. I like it. It's going to be better for the tree 5 years from now. Problem with that is it's going to look terrible when you make that cut now. So yes, it is the right thing to do for the tree, 100%. If I did this on a client's property, they might hate me because now half of that tree is gone. And that looks like probably a fruit tree. If it were mine, 100%, I would definitely do that. For the structure and betterment of that tree, I'm not going to improve the appearance, but I'm going to improve the structure. I would definitely take that off. So you're not wrong, you're right. Go ahead.
Yeah, on that right side, maybe take one in the middle so it's a little bit sparser.
I like that as well. So that is a little bit, yep. So that what he just gave is kind of a half measure on that. So we have one where we're going to take the whole thing off. We have another one where we're going to take this center out right there. What that's going to do, I like that. That is something, if you can touch this tree multiple times, that's the way to go. Because what that does is it's going to stunt that stem. So what's happening is this is trying to become its own stem. If you look up there, it's essentially, you've got some shoots coming off of that are as tall as the rest of the tree, even though it's a much smaller stem. If you go in there and take some of it out, it's going to stunt that and make it more like a branch. And it's going to allow the rest of the tree to kind of fill in that spot and then come back a couple years later and take it all the way off. So if it's in your backyard, that's a great way to do it because it's going to be a more stepped approach. What else are we going to do? It's not the greatest photo, but what else are we going to do? I see some stuff in there that's bugging me. The one going off that way towards the garage, I would definitely take that off. And so what she said is take off the horizontal. So we've got this horizontal limb going out there like that. If you don't want to take that off entirely, because again, that's going to put a big hole in the tree, the thing that I really don't like is this shoot right there going straight up from that horizontal limb. No question I'm taking that off. What I'm going to try to do through the pruning is develop some open space on the right side of the upper canopy. So that way the rest of the tree will want to grow into that. Trees grow towards light. If there's a branch here, and there's a branch here, they're going to grow like that, away from each other to get more sunlight. So by opening up those holes, you're going to allow the tree to kind of fill into that side. Something else?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can, it looks like the leader is kind of going off to the side. I'm wondering if you can kind of like artificially create a new leader that's closer to the center.
You can. I don't think it's going to matter, though. And that's not saying, again, no one has given a bad answer. You've all given good answers. I'm just giving you what I kind of think about when I do that, is this is a tree. If you look at it, it wants to go straight up. So it kind of wants to sucker, water sprout, grow straight up. So this is going to be a tree that's really hard to get a good central stem on. I think it's probably because, again, I think it's a fruit tree. And if you look at how shady it is in there, that tree's doing whatever it can to just get up there and get sunlight. I like all those. Those are all good answers. On the right side, crepe myrtle. What would we do? What would we do? I like it. That's pretty much all I'd do. Do not top the crepe myrtle. Boo. Yeah, I would get rid of the suckers because, and that is a species that just does it. It has nothing to do with rootstock and grafting and all that. Crepe myrtles just grow, and they want to grow. All my crepe myrtles in my backyard, I have to strip the suckers off every year. Otherwise, it turns into a crepe myrtle shrub, and you don't want a crepe myrtle shrub. So that's good.
Flowers, after they bloom,
Uh-huh.
they're like pods, should you cut them off? Or
There's no need. Nope. You can if you want to. Don't top it.
grow better?
No. Hand back there?
Yeah, I was just thinking back to the house I had before, where we had a beautiful crepe myrtle. We never topped it, but it would get so top heavy.
Yes.
That we had, like, you couldn't drive a car. It was in a bad spot.
Yep.
to drive to the driveway.
Yeah.
But it was beautiful, but it really was a nuisance.
Couple things. So, yes, no matter what, it's going to do that. And it's because we as humans have done that. First of all, it's the wrong tree in the wrong spot, too close to the driveway. Second thing is
In the tree's defense, we put the driveway in after.
okay. So the other thing with that is, got to get back to where I was, sorry. Yes. We as humans love to make things that are beautiful, right? So we've bred crepe myrtles to have the biggest, showiest flowers. We've selected them. We've made these kind of monstrosities. It's kind of like with fruit trees where we made them make these food for us. It's super cool. But in the process, the trees are like terrible with diseases and insects. So we have to take good care of them because we've made them do one thing for us. Crepe myrtles are kind of the same thing. We don't have this issue with oaks or maples or just native trees. It's with a very exotic species that we've specifically selected. There's nothing to do about it except go out there after it's rained and everything's so heavy and just beat it with a rake. And if you need to cut it off, cut it off. Just don't be making big cuts on a crepe myrtle. Okay, structure. Now we're going to get into branch spacing. Not hard to figure out. Stem, super important. And you need to know the difference between an X-current and D-current tree in order to understand what kind of structural pruning you need to go after. And here's my way of remembering this. X-current tree, Xmas tree, as in Christmas tree. Christmas trees are a single stem. You're never going to get a multi-stem Fraser fir. You would take it back. So X-current, Xmas tree, single stem. It is supposed to be a single-stemmed tree. D-current tree obviously then means it's going to have multiple stems. Good examples of X-current trees would be conifers, pines, spruces, firs, bald cypress, all those fun things. Most of the hardwoods that we have around here are also X-current trees. I'm not going to say all the oaks, but 90% of the oaks are an X-current tree. Same thing with maples, gums, poplars. Most of the trees we deal with are X-current trees. Most of the problems we have with trees in our landscapes are X-current trees that decided to go D-current. Trees like elms, you're never going to find a single stem elm. You're going to find an elm that might go up 30 or 40 feet on a single stem and then branch out into these huge leads. That is just the genetics of the tree. It's supposed to look like that. And trying to make an elm be one single stem would kill it, actually. I just wouldn't survive. So this is another red maple, because they're so easy to study. And I have a couple slides of this, but you have two stems, two very codominant stems. Dominant means you're the one in charge. Codominant means you have somebody else with you. That's how we look at stems. So if you have two stems, if you're supposed to be an X-current tree, single stem tree, and you have two stems, it's called codominant stems. You can see there that somebody made a pretty big, bold cut on that tree. They cut a whole stem off. If it's your tree and you don't have to answer to anybody for it, that's a great way to go, if it's young. If it's not, you don't want to make that whole cut. But here's what happens 3 years later, and then there's what happens 5 years later. 3 years later, it's filling back in. It's kind of filling that area back in. Remember, there's no shade over here now. There's full sun over here, so it's going to want to grow and fill that area in. And then at year 5, you can't even tell there had been another stem. And in the center there is actually the stem wound, the scar from where that branch was, or that stem was taken off. That codominant stem was just fully removed. You can barely tell it's there. Come back 5 years after that, you will never even be able to tell that that was taken off. A better option than just taking that whole thing off, if you can touch this tree multiple times, or if you're a little bit more squeamish about having a half of a tree for a couple years, you can actually just reduce the height of one of those stems. Choose one. Those are pretty much even and equal stems. They're both great. So just choose which one and reduce the height of one back down to another limb. And what that's going to do is it's going to do something called subordination. A subordinate is under you. So not only are you removing a section of that stem, you're also you're removing the section of the stem. You're now stunting that stem because you've removed food making capability. There's less sugar being made there. And there's also something, there's a plant hormone called auxins. Yes, it's auxins. And auxins are produced by the very tips, so the apical growing portions, the apical stems, apical buds. And it kind of like floods down through the rest of the tree. And as that happens, what it does is it tells everything else, hey, I'm in charge, I'm growing, you guys stay underneath me. And it's just a chemical form of control the tree has. By cutting the top of one of those stems and reducing the height, you now are getting rid of two sources of auxins. You only have one source of auxins, so it's going to end up not only physically stunting this branch and making it have less food, but it's also chemically stunting it as well. Yep.
So in that tree, would you go ahead and cut, because maybe it's just the way the picture is, but it looks like the one that appears to be on the right
Yes,
is a little bit smaller than the one
they're the same tree.
on the left.
They're the same tree, though. So, and that's, I did, yeah.
But would you go ahead and just cut the one that's a little bit smaller?
Oh, I see what you mean. I'm sorry. You mean the one stem on the right. Yes, I would probably actually choose that one. I would have probably actually chosen the other one than they did. Yes, I probably would have reduced the height of that one because it is a little bit short.
5% rule apply, you just cut it back
No. You cut it back, you always want to cut back to something. So you cut it back to another lateral branch, and you want to cut it back enough that you think you're going to stunt it. There's no hard and fast rule on that. That's kind of where the art of it comes in. You look at it and think, how much do I need to take off of that to make it noticeable, not only visually, but also for the tree. If it's noticeable visually for you, that's a good chance you've done it properly. If you can barely tell you've done it, probably didn't do much at all. Good question. Sorry, I was getting confused. I thought you meant the two separate pictures. And then there's what happens if you let it go. The one on the right side, 100% red maple. I'm not sure what the one on the left side is. But you get bark in between those two stems. Because remember, the way trees grow is we just put more tissue around the outside and on the tips. So if you have two stems that are right next to each other, they have to grow. So they're going to get bigger. And as they get bigger, they start to compress bark in between those two stems. That is called included bark. It is bark that is now included in that crotch. It has zero structural holding capability. Zero. So it's kind of like those two are just laminated and pressed against each other. I always use included bark. I always explain included bark by kind of saying, you know, when you buy pre-sliced cheese at the store and it has those pieces of paper in between the slices to make it easier to pull the slices apart, that is included bark. It just makes it so that the stems just want to rip apart. You end up with a couple things. First of all, if you're lucky, it grows for a decade and doesn't split in half. Don't quite know how that happened. Or it does start to split in half, and you have to start Frankensteining your tree by putting steel in there to hold it together. Or you end up with it on the ground. A lot of times people see these trees that split in half, and they'll see, it's really hard to see in this photo, but in these two broken areas, here and there, it's darker, and it looks almost like it's been burnt. And a lot of people, when they see that, they think, oh, my tree got struck by lightning, the wood's all burnt. What that actually is that's just bark that's been smushed in there. Or it's some decay that has started because water has been seeping down into that crack. If that were your tree, would you want to keep that? So you have an arborist come in, or your cousin or whatever, hit me.
When they press together, does that affect the xylem as well, so that the nutrients don't flow as well?
So what you actually end up having is, once they're pressed together, they die in that section. So they're not going to push each other apart more, because what you do is the cambium, which is the actively growing tissue, it gets compressed in there, and it actually just gets smushed and dies. So you don't get any kind of vascular knitting at all. There will never be. You could take that tree and split it, cut it in half, like just cut it down, and the wood will just fall apart. Because it's not even that it's affecting the xylem goes away in there. There is no longer, it just turns into kind of heartwood, even though it's not really heartwood. And it's kind of like with girdling roots, it's a strangulation where the wood, that tissue just dies in between those two. Does that make sense? Okay. If you have that tree in your backyard, clean up the broken part. Do you think you can keep the rest of the tree? For a year or two. If it's in the middle of a field where you don't care about anything when the other half falls off, go for it. But structurally, that tree is toast at this point. The interesting thing is, the left standing side is as strong as it was before the break. Because when you have codominant stems, the only place that you really have a change is where they meet. So when they meet together, that's where you actually get adhesion. That's where they are together. Everything beyond that, where that bark has been included, it's essentially like they're two different trees. So on a tree like this, it's almost like the trunk is now here, because those two aren't connected anywhere above that spot. So that tree, the left side, is just as strong structurally as it was before the break, because the stuff that broke out wasn't even really attached to that other side. The reason it's going to fail, a couple reasons, is decay You have all these torn, broken areas. Decay is going to get in there, and it's going to undermine, essentially, the remaining portion. And the other thing is now you have extremely different physics and loads on the tree because they had worked somewhat together, but you've lost that now. So now it's a completely different dynamic. Yep.
Sorry.
No, you're hit me.
If you subordinate one side.
Yes.
Gradually, as it heals,
Yes.
the part you subordinated, does that produce auxins? Is that all?
No. So it won't, because if you've done the subordination properly, if you've reduced it enough, it has now been chemically stunted, and it won't be able to grow back because the one that's left is going to be the one producing auxins, and the apical buds say, I'm producing auxins, the rest of you don't get to produce auxins. So it just kind of sits there already chemically stunted by the other auxin-producing apical buds. Okay, you can already see both pruning there, but so maintaining a natural plant form is not something I typically hear. Somebody doesn't say to me, I want my tree to look natural. That's not usually what pruning is aimed at, but at the same time, that's how you should be looking at trees typically. That is essentially a decurrent tree. That is a tree that is supposed to be multi-stemmed. I can't tell what that is because these photos are ancient, but if you know that that's going to be a decurrent tree, prune it as a decurrent tree. Prune it as a tree that is going to have multiple leads. And what you do then is you just kind of open it up. You thin it. Again, I hate the word thinning now. I've changed my way of thinking. What you're doing is you're removing limbs to improve, how would I say that? I would not say thin. I would say selectively remove limbs to, I like that. I like improved balance. That's a hard one to say. It's what's that? Airflow. What's actually been done though, here, it's proper branch spacing. That's proper branch spacing. What they've done is they've pruned it to develop proper branch spacing between the three stems. You're not just going in there taking stuff out being like, it's too dense, let's get it out of here. What you're doing is you're going in there and you're actually removing twigs on something this small, but you're removing branches to allow for proper branch spacing between the multiple leaders that are developing. I forget why I had this in here. It's a beautiful tree. I think we just need to look at that. It's a nice tree. Nothing really needs to be done to it. We do have some crossing and rubbing. Yep, hit me.
When do I prune my lilac?
We're going to get to that. We will get to that. That is a loaded question. Okay, and then you have the hand of man pruning, where you're like, I'm going to do everything humanly possible to make this tree not what it's supposed to be. I have some bonsais at my house. They're not bonsais. They're small trees I prune a little bit, but they're not true bonsais. Bonsai pruning is a decades process. It takes decades to properly develop a bonsai tree. Same thing with topiary pruning, which is the bottom, the spiral. Anything that's been made into a shape, be it a Dalmatian or a square, or rather a cube, that's topiary pruning, and that's just to show off how much money you have because you can hire a gardener to prune your shrubs every month. That is what topiary pruning is. And then espalier pruning is, by the name, French. It's beautiful. It's really cool. It is also one of those ones where you're showing people just how much money you have because it's actually harder to develop espalier than it is to develop a topiary. Espaliers, if you look at all that beautiful crossing, branching, it's just gorgeous. That has taken years and a lot of planting. If you're going to plant a tree and do it espalier, you have to prune that like 4 times a year. Just know that. You have to have supplemental support to direct and actually tie back limbs. You have to tie things back. You can't buy that really nice espalier camellia at the nursery that has that like little piece of lattice behind it and think it's going to be like that forever. That plant does not want to do that. You're going to have to touch it hundreds of times. when do we prune? It's perfect. Cleaning versus major pruning. Cleaning is getting those 4 Ds anytime, doesn't matter. Major pruning. So a lot of people, winter pruning is the best time to prune plants from not from flowering and not from a fruiting standpoint. Ignoring flowering and fruiting, winter's the best time to prune plants, just because they're dormant. You and I do not want to be awake when we have surgery, so they put us to sleep. I can't put a tree to sleep, Mother Nature can. So it is especially with deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the winter, in the fall through the winter, they're much better to prune in the winter. Some evergreens, if you prune them in the winter, you'll actually do more damage. There's always an exception. You need to consider leaf production, diseases, sap flow, cold injury, bloom time. Leaf production, one of my old colleagues always said the worst time to prune a tree and there's no science behind this, but just anecdotally, the worst time to prune a tree is in early spring because the tree has just taken all of its resources, dumped them into the tree to make leaves, and now you cut some of those leaves off. So it's kind of an insult to injury. Let those leaves harden off and then go ahead and prune. Diseases, luckily we don't have many disease issues we have to worry about. The one we do actually have to worry about here is Dutch elm disease. You can, but you shouldn't prune elms in the growing season because it's not like the spores from Dutch elm disease, which is a fungal infection, are blown through the air. But what happens is when you put the cut on an elm, it gives off wound pheromones, it gives off stress pheromones from that wounding, which draws in elm bark beetles. Elm bark beetles are the vector for Dutch elm disease. It's like putting out the buffet is open sign for the tree, and then you're going to get Dutch elm disease. If you do that in the winter, elm bark beetles are dormant. They're in the trees. They're not flying around, so you don't have to worry about it. And by that point, those cuts will have dried off and hardened off. They're not going to produce the stress pheromones. The elm bark beetles aren't going to get called in. Sap flow, I personally don't care about sap flow. It's not really a big issue. Something you will find though is if you prune like right now on a tree that bleeds a lot, holy cow is it going to bleed a lot. Pretty much any maple, if you go out and prune them right now, it's actually kind of fun if you do it when it's below freezing and it's sunny. The bark will warm up, sap will be moving, and the cuts will bleed and you'll get sapsicles, which tastes like a really mild maple syrup. It's kind of cool. Especially on Japanese maples, you can come through, and Japanese maples are maples, so it's not like you're going to die from the sap. It's just a very watery maple syrup flavor. Kind of fun. Cold injury, especially with evergreens. If I were to go through and like shear hollies right now, you do run a risk of that late season, really hard freeze. You have all those open cuts and it's worse for the plant. And then bloom time, super duper important for most landscape plants, especially the ones you planted for flowering if you prune them at the wrong time. To answer your question now, lilacs bloom on old wood. So the real thing you need to know, and that's where the pruning calendar comes in. Chesterfield, the Virginia Extension has a really cool pruning calendar that shows you when you should and should not prune. And the most important ones, I think they have like, yep, right there. They have like the best time to prune. They have a do not prune. Mostly what it comes down to is if that plant blooms on old or new wood. If it blooms on old wood, that means it developed its flower buds last year. So if you have a dogwood, dogwoods already have those buds, those kind of like disc-shaped buds. Those are the flower buds for this spring. If I were to prune it, you're going to cut those off. You're not going to have flowers. Lilac, I've got a lilac in front of my house. It has these big fat buds at the very tops, and that's in there you have leaf primordia, which are the little baby leaves, as well as buds in there, and those are the flower buds. So anything that blooms, good rule of thumb, there's always exceptions, stuff that blooms in early spring through, let's say, late May, blooms on old wood, because it takes time for those buds to develop. So if it's going to bloom in early spring through May, it had to have already had those buds developed. So azaleas, rhododendrons, dogwoods, all the fruit trees, most of the fruit trees, bloom on old wood. So if you prune them between when they bloomed and when they are going to bloom, you're cutting off all those blooms. If they bloom on new wood, you need to make sure that you don't prune them after they started growing. So crepe myrtles, everybody knows, don't prune crepe myrtles once they start growing. That is because they bloom on new wood. Most of the time, crepe myrtle pruning means topping. When people talk about crepe myrtle pruning, if you're going to top it, you're cutting off all those new growing tissue, the growing tips. Those growing tips are where the buds are going to develop. So you don't want to prune that after it starts growing. Use this, super great. I know if you look in there where it looks, it looks like you shouldn't prune anything in August, September, October. And that is pretty much every plant there. I think that's just because they don't want you pruning in the stressful time of the year, I guess. I'm not sure. But you really go off of the best time to prune portion.
Is that by like zone?
What's that?
Is that, do they have different ones for different zones?
Well, I'm not sure, but it's coming from Virginia Tech, and does that actually have a zone on it? It doesn't. But let's say you moved to North Carolina, get the pruning calendar from NC State. I grew up in Pennsylvania, Penn State, Land-Grant University. I'd get it from Pennsylvania, and it's pretty much tailored. I mean, we're 7A, 7B. I keep doing that. So you'll be fine. You'll be fine. I pity whoever's listening to this after it's been recorded. Future people, I'm so sorry. Okay, so we've not even talked about cutting anything yet. We haven't talked about how to cut stuff because you need to think about why you're cutting. That's why we've just beat that horse to death. You need to think about why you're doing it before you do it. So, how and how much to prune? When transplanting, only the 4 Ds. Don't try to balance the root to shoot ratio. Only what you can reach from the ground. So I like telling stories. You've heard this story before, I'm sorry. Ladders are terrible. I hate ladders, terrible. My best friend, who I talk to sometimes 3 times a day, because he's an arborist. He lives in Philadelphia, I live here. We're both bored driving around and we're talking about trees. His son is 7 years old now. His son was born, obviously 7 years ago, but his son had been born, he was maybe 6 months old, and John was getting a hard hat off of an elevated shelf in the shop where he works, the really good tree company. Concrete floor, extension ladder, leaning against the shelf. Went up, about 12 feet up, to grab a hard hat, some safety gear for his crew, ironically. And can anybody guess what happened to that ladder? It's against concrete floor. I saw you do that. Yep. Yeah, I guess it would be more of that. The bottom kicked out. No one was holding it, and he rode it down and came straight down on both his arms and broke both of his arms, here and here. And again, he has a 6-month-old at home. He's relatively newly married, and he can't do anything. His wife is having to take care of the baby and him. Ladders are terrible. I hate ladders. Don't get on a ladder if you can at all cost avoid it. Just look up ladder fails on YouTube and you'll understand why to never, ever use a ladder. Limits per year for shape and structure, again, it's 25%. They always say you can do 30-35% for limb raising. You can, but try to stay away from that. Stick with 25%. You're not going to stress the tree. The reason they say that you can do a little bit more for limb raising is because those branches are already being shaded somewhat. And so they're not the most critical food producing branches. So you can take a little bit more, but I still would rather not. And the other thing is what's the difference between 25% and 30%? It's 5%, right? Can you visually pick out 5% of that tree? Can't happen. That's why I always tell people to go less, because I guarantee you your 25% is going to turn into 35% real fast. Opt for taking less. Less is more. And it's also much easier to divide in even numbers rather than odd numbers. So half of a half is a quarter. Doing this whole third thing, it's just harder to do. Young versus mature trees, many versus large cuts. Young trees, you can be brutal to young trees. Once they're established, if it's newly planted, no. But once it's established in the landscape, you can be pretty darn brutal to the things you do, like cutting a whole side off the tree to get a good single stem. If that was a 70-foot tree in that slide that I showed you before where half the tree was taken off, you're going to end up with a dead tree. So mature trees, much more gentle. Many versus large cuts. We all learn in our careers, it was so much easier to make like a big cut, get it done, really dramatic, branches off, you're done. In my specs now for when I send our crews out and our arborists out, I will very rarely tell them to take branches off back to the stem. And the reason I'm thinking is, so I would much rather make a lot of cuts on the exterior of the canopy to change the overall dynamics of the tree, rather than taking big branches off back to the main stem of the tree. And it's going to go back to large wounds versus small wounds. A large wound obviously takes a lot longer to heal. And if you're putting a large wound, a whole limb removal, on a mature tree back to the main stem, not only are you having a long time for it to heal, but you're also putting decay and decline on the main structural member of the tree. So you're just putting decay back into the stem of the tree. I would much rather have a little bit of decline on the exterior of the canopy where you're not going to have a whole tree fail, you might have a branch fail. There's my plug. Consider an arborist. If you have to get off the ground, call somebody, please, and use an arborist, an ISA certified arborist. In Virginia, there are 0 regulations on my industry. There are OSHA regulations, but they're in the same thing as landscaping. There's nothing that prevents all of you from starting your own tree company and becoming arborists. Arborist is just a dictionary term for someone who cares for woody plants. You can, by definition, be an arborist. By the end of the day, you can call yourself an arborist because you go out and prune a tree and you've cared for a woody plant. So make sure they're an ISA certified arborist. That is the International Society of Arboriculture. I will tell you, it is not a terribly hard test. There are a lot of people who are ISA certified arborists, and I would treat that as the bare minimum for what you want in terms of a person touching your trees. That is not saying being a certified arborist is bad, because I've been one for 12 years. So. And then proper cuts back to something. That's another thing. I've got branch collar, 1/3 rule, 3-step cut, and then cut back to something. You just don't want to cut in the middle of a branch. You want to cut back to another branch or to a bud. There you go. It's almost like I've done this talk before. Where to make the cuts? Again, branch collar. You don't want to cut the branch collar off, so you want to cut directly outside of the branch collar. So again, I would much rather you leave a stub than cut too close. So if you're erring on the side of caution, leave it a little bit stubby. And then again, here's the one that just kills me. These are not one is not right, one is not wrong. They are both right. So don't look at this and be like, which one's right? I'm confused. These are both examples of the 1/3 rule. Think of that not as a stem. I wish I could just rotate this slide on its side. The part going up, we're going to cut off. The part the large section up there going straight up, we're going to cut that off. And we're going to cut it back to that other thing. We're going to cut to something. So we're going to cut that off. We're going to cut it back to something. We're doing great. We're doing it so it doesn't break off, right? We have an objective. We know what we're cutting, and we know where we're cutting. We need to make sure that we're cutting back to something that can support the rest of this. So you have to cut back to something that is 1/3 or larger of what it's being cut back to. So if this is 6 inches, so I'm going to go over there because that's a perfect 1/3 rule. If the bottom is 6 inches and you have a branch coming off that is 2 inches, that is 1/3 or larger, than the parent stem that it's coming off of. So you always want to cut back to something that's large enough. Over here, 6 inches and 5 inches, no problem at all, because you're cutting back to something that's almost exactly the same. And what you're really thinking about, and this should make it easier to think about, is if you take too much off, the branch is going to starve. And it will starve and then die. So even though you've done everything right, you've thought about why you want to cut it off, you've made a perfect cut, and you're cutting it back to the right spot. If you don't cut it back to the right thing, something that's big enough and vigorous enough to support the branch below it, it will die. So if these are both 6 inches again, and I try to cut it back to a branch that's 1 inch, it's too small. That's not 1/3 or larger. 2 to 6, that's 1/3 or larger. 5 to 6, that's 5/6. That's almost a 1-to-1 cut. So make sure you're always cutting back to something large enough. So what you're cutting back to and leaving must be big enough, must be at least 1/3 the diameter of what it's attached to at the end. Does that make sense? Perfect. I always screw somebody up. It's super confusing. I wish there was a better way to do it. I was talking with somebody about it, and they gave me a perfect explanation I've already forgotten. Like,
If I'm cutting a 1-inch branch,
nope, you're cutting back to a 1-inch branch. Yeah, I'm going to use the pen. There's actually a pen. Oh, no. Come on. There we go. I'm going to cut this off. And I'm going to cut that off, right? So all of this is now gone. This is all gone. And what I'm leaving is this. That stays, including all the branching coming out.
so if the 2 was a 1, you would not
Exactly.
go
There it is. Yep. Let's get rid of all the numbers. If you have a 3-inch stem and you're going to cut it back, cut it down, this is 3 inches, you're going to cut back to this right here. These fingers are gone, this is left. How big must this be? This is 3 inches. How big must that be? 1 inch. There you go. And you can do all your multiplication and division from there. Yes?
Does this only apply to, this is 1/3 rule for a stem or we're cutting?
Or branches. Stems or branches. Yep.
So if you're going to cut back a branch, it needs to be.
Back to something that meets these requirements. Yes. And so you know how we were talking about subordination, reducing the height, and you said 25%, was it? Somebody asked me, do you reduce it by 25%? Somebody did. No. You reduce it back to something that meets that 1/3 rule. Because what happens is if you cut it back to if you cut a 6-inch stem back to that little 1-inch branch coming off, that whole thing's going to die. It cannot produce enough food to create wound wood and to create future growth. So it'll just starve and die. And so the other important thing to think about is, especially with subordination, food flows down, sugars flow down. So when you're doing subordination, you've got these 2 stems that are going up, and you cut one down, it's not like the sugars are going to come down from the remaining one and go back up. That's just not how flow works in trees. It's not going to go down and start feeding it again. So the only way for this side that you've reduced down to stay alive is if there's enough sugars coming down to keep that alive. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. I feel I do this, I talk about this every year, and I kind of feel like it's kind of silly at this point because you shouldn't top trees, and I feel like that's general knowledge now, but I find out that that's not general knowledge. Tree topping, that is where you make heading cuts. You're not cutting back to anything. There is no thought. The only goal is 2 goals. My tree is too big, or my tree scares me. Those are the 2 things. And the goal is to make your tree less scary or to make it smaller. And those are not doable goals. And that is where you go through and just remove 50 to 100% of foliage. You get really, really, really bad things happening. You get decay, you get suckering, you get terrible architecture, sunburn and bark damage where all of a sudden these, especially on like a thin bark tree, it has been shaded by the leaves. The leaves want the food, the bark doesn't, and you'll actually get UV burns on the bark. And it just makes the trees look terrible. So look at that tree. Huh. A lot of times, you have about a 50-50 chance when you top a tree of it surviving. I think it's a brilliant business model for somebody to top a tree because they make a lot of money topping the tree, and there's a 50% chance they get to cut that tree down next year because it died. It's great. Guaranteed return customer. Don't do it. The other thing is if it doesn't die, in a couple years, it's going to be the same size because the tree wants to be that size. It has grown to that size, and it needs all those leaves to maintain that size. So what it's going to do is it's going to take all of its stored up carbohydrates and nutrients and dump them into making new tissue. So now you've pretty much, in a couple years, lost the smaller tree that you were shooting for. Yep.
So the tree right there is like hanging over the house.
Yes.
Probably dropping branches over the house, maybe that's why they thought they would cut it back.
Okay.
In that case, what should they do?
Take the tree down.
Just take it completely down.
So, and that is a very loaded question because I can talk for about 20 minutes on that. If you're that concerned about the tree, just cut it down. The only safe tree is a tree that's missing. I'm something called a Tree Risk Assessment Qualified Arborist, TRAC, and that just makes me look at trees from a different way of looking at trees, especially from a safety and structural standpoint. And it also helps me write things that aren't going to get my pantsuit off of me. As I write things in the industry, I will never say your tree is safe. There is no safe tree. If the tree is up in the air and gravity hasn't stopped working, that tree is going to be on the ground at some point. So just cut the tree down. What I will say, though, is by doing that, you've actually started yourself down a precipitous fall where that tree is going to either die or become much more dangerous. Because what happens, and I'll show you that on some of the stuff I bring in, is it wants to grow, so it puts all this new tissue out. And if you think about how trees grow, they only grow on the very outside, right? So as that tree grew up, it developed all this beautiful wood going up that's structurally sound, and the architecture is great, and you have years and years and years of that tissue being there and being held on properly. Go through, cut it all off, and throw a bunch of suckers up there. Those suckers, it looks like on this photo, those suckers are probably about a year old. You got all that growth back within a year. But they're literally like glued onto the tree. They're only attached to 1 year's worth of wood. They're just kind of plastered there. Every year they grow, they're going to be a little bit better attached, a little bit better attached, a little bit better attached. But the problem is they're growing super fast now. And so you have these huge amounts of growth on these really skinny, spindly stems, and they're just kind of stuck there. You get a good wind or an ice storm, it's just going to rip everything off, and it's all going to fall on your house anyways. And if it doesn't happen in a couple years, it'll happen 20 or 30 years down the road because all those cuts are going to get decay. Those stems are going to turn hollow, and now you're going to have all these branches growing on a hollow branch, like all these like suckers and stems coming off, but they're coming off a hollow branch, and now you have structural failure too. In terms of branching hanging over top of houses, that's something I deal with pretty much on a daily basis that people are worried about it. Something that as long as it's a properly attached branch, you've got that branch bark ridge, it's not like a really tight crotch, but those branches going out are the stronger portions of the tree. They're actually stronger than the more upright portions. And the reason being is because of gravity. And I liken it to, I had this conversation with somebody today, is if you go to the gym, you're stronger because you're working out. Those horizontal branches are working out 24/7. They have to counteract gravity in order to stay up and grow out that way. And they actually develop things called tension and compression wood. Imagine my arm being the branch. My bicep is kind of like tension wood. It is under tension. It's being pulled down. On the bottom, you get something called compression wood. And it kind of acts like the way my muscles on my arm work. The tricep and bicep work to balance my arm out. Same thing with compression and tension wood. So those branches that are horizontal actually end up being a lot stronger. They scare the pants off of people, but they're the stronger limbs versus the ones that are straight up. Because the ones that are straight up don't have to develop any of that compression and tension wood, and in a wind load, they're more likely just to snap out. It also makes trees just straight up ugly. Now, first of all, the tree on the left, pretty sure it's a Bradford pear. What happened there? They planted a Bradford pear in a street tree, as a street tree. So first of all, look at that tree coffin it's planted in. That sidewalk well is abysmal. The fact that tree's alive is astounding, but it's because it's a pear and you can't kill a pear. And they just put something in that's just, I can't believe I'm gonna say this, they shouldn't even have trees there. There's just, that sidewalk's not big enough, there's not adequate soil there. That's just bad urban planning, and that's well beyond me right now. That's super bad urban planning. I wouldn't even put a tree there. On the right side, people did that. You know why people did that? Because their neighbors do it, or their parents did it, or their landscaper talked them into doing it. And what that is it's like, well, I love when people move from out of Virginia. They move from somewhere outside of Virginia, move in, and like, all my neighbors cut their crepe myrtles back. Should I do that? I'm like, please, God, no. Couple things. We don't have a lot of snow here, and this is very much just anecdotal. We don't have a lot of snow here, so we don't have a lot of snow moving revenue for landscapers in the winter, and we also can't grow grass in the winter here like we can in Florida. So landscapers need something to do in the winter. It's great revenue right there. Come through and top all the crepe myrtles, and you get to do it every year. That's the other thing is if you do it once, you pretty much have to do it in perpetuity, unless you want the tree to grow back, which would be the best case scenario. So don't do it, please. Yeah. The other reason people do it is because they put that big, beautiful Natchez crepe myrtle that has that cinnamon bark, beautiful white flowers. It's going to look great against their brick house. Perfect. Except it grows 35 to 40 feet tall. It's one of the bigger ones out there. And it's just a terrible tree for the spot. There are literally crepe myrtles that don't get bigger than that. They're ugly. I don't like them, but they're a shrub. Pick the right one. And I always try to steer people away from, like, people just want, so your shirt, that beautiful lavender shirt, people love that color of crepe myrtle. I forget what cultivar it is, but they can get pretty big too. And there are some smaller ones. Don't always go after the flower color. Go after the size it's going to be. The one, and I know it says all these crepe myrtles have been improperly pruned or topped. There's always an exception. That one on the very far right, you see how it looks like you're starting to get kind of knuckles at the end of those branches? There is a pruning practice called pollarding. It is a European practice. I've actually seen it in San Francisco. It is really cool when done properly. No one does it properly unless they know what they're doing. Pollarding is it's an ancient form of pruning, and it's where you go through, and it actually developed because it's for fires. So people would have tinder for fires because it creates all these sticks. And you could go through and essentially manage your tree. Instead of cutting the tree down for your firewood, you could manage your tree as a source of renewable firewood. And you go through, cut everything off in the winter, use it for your firewood, it all grows back, and you cut it off again. Done properly, it can actually be really pretty. And you'll get these giant knuckles of all of this, the epicormic shoots that are coming out, breaking out. And if you cut that off, you're no longer pollarding. You actually have to go through and cut every one of those individual suckers off back to that knuckle and just maintain a big old knuckle. I loved watching, there was a company that had pollarded their crepe myrtles gorgeously, just beautiful. And I don't know if somebody actually knew what they were doing, but they did it really well. One year they came through and literally cut the knuckles in half. They just took a chainsaw and cut the knuckles in half because that was the fastest way to get it off, and just left these like half sphere knuckles. Terrible. Okay, You all know this is a loaded question, so answer accordingly. Which tree's prettier? Exactly, it's a loaded question. Aesthetically, almost the tree on the right's almost aesthetically nicer because it really shows the form of the tree off. It's really open and airy. You can see through the tree. It doesn't look too dense. And that's because somebody got up there who didn't know how to climb, and they just made as many cuts in that tree to get to that 25% their boss told them to. We got to thin the tree 25%. They don't like climbing that much, and they just started cutting everything off the interior of the tree because they don't have to move around. They can just stay there and cut everything out. That is called lion's tailing. If you think about what a lion's tail looks like on a lion, it is skinny, 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 puff of fur. That's what every single one of those branches looks like. It's skinny, skinny, skinny. They've stripped everything from the interior. Objectively, the prettiest tree I've ever seen is off Old Gun Road. If any of you are familiar with Old Gun Road, it's all that really twisty spot. It's Old Gun Road East. And it was a gentleman named Mr. Singleton, the Singleton Center, very rich man. Had somebody go in there, and he had the most beautiful white oak you've ever seen. Huge, probably about 100-foot spread on it. Maybe only about 80 feet tall. Just gorgeous. You could walk into it and see through the entire canopy of the tree. It was just like a shell of foliage. And he had somebody go in and just lion's tail the living daylights out of this tree all the time. It was pretty, but imagine what happens when a storm comes to that tree on the right. So a couple things. First of all, not only are they going to break more readily, but when they break, you can't cut them back to anything. So if you think about it, there's mass dampers. Mass dampers are things that prevent too much movement. If you think about all those branches, as those stems taper up, all those branches act as mass dampers, and they keep it from swaying and moving too much. You've also now opened up holes for those branches to move even more. And then when they do inevitably snap, because they're going to snap, you have nothing to cut back to. Remember, you have to cut back to something, and you specifically want to follow the 1/3 rule, so you want to cut back to something large enough. When all those tops break out, you're just left essentially now with a topped tree. You can't prune it back and repair it by pruning it back to a proper branch. So it can look really pretty. It is a mark of a poor climber and someone who just doesn't understand trees. So I think this is the end of this slide, and then we're going to bring stuff in here, and I'll get you out of here. A friend sent me this years ago, and I thought it was cool. What it is somebody topped a tree. Surprise, surprise, the tree died. I don't know if they did this on purpose. If they did, that's a lot of money for something quite crazy, but I'm guessing the tree probably just died. But I always say, people who top trees are tree butchers. I like to also say that they're not butchers because butchers are skilled at what they do. Tree toppers have essentially zero skill. They're just up there cutting, not knowing what they're doing. Oh, nope, sorry, tools, and then we'll talk about this real quick. Hand pruners. There are bypass and there are anvil. If you watch these move, this blade bypasses this over here. It looks like a parrot's beak, essentially. Then there's something called anvil, where instead of having a curved blade, you have a straight blade and then just a chunk of steel. What this does is it acts almost like scissors. It cuts kind of from both sides. Anvil cuts and mushes. So if this is the flat anvil over here, that just gets crushed until the blade passes through. It just does a lot more damage. So bypass pruners. Loppers, pruning saws, pole pruners, protective clothing. Okay, so I'll show you. Loppers are essentially same thing as these, but bigger. Pruning saws, you want to use what I have, and I have a photo of it. It is a tri-edged saw blade. So if you look up there, it actually has 3 edges on each tooth, and they're offset from one another. Works beautifully, puts a really nice cut on a tree. Who here has a bow saw? One of those ones with a straight blade. Who here can make a good cut on a tree with a bow saw? Straight up impossible. Bow saws are great if you want to like be cutting a tree down with your family for a Christmas tree. That's where a bow saw is super great. Bow saws for pruning are terrible just because you can't actually get them in anywhere. Think about the tight crotches I can get this in versus that giant bow saw. You just can't do it. The other thing is, this hurts a lot. Who here knows what shape a bayonet is? What shape is a bayonet? It's triangular. Why is it triangular?
Most damage.
Because it's a terrible wound. You cannot stitch up a bayonet wound because it is a triangular wound, because you have to come in from 3 different angles. This is a bunch of tiny little bayonets. First of all, I think probably one of the times I bled the most is when I accidentally slapped my hand and just put a bunch of little things. But they were tiny, super tiny little holes. Bled like a stuck pig just because they're triangular. Other thing is these things cut. So be very careful when using any handsaw. Also, same thing with these. They'll pop your finger right off if you're not paying attention to what you're doing. These are called Felcos. I recommend everybody who ever touches a plant own Felcos. You can see there the difference between the bypass and the anvil. Corona, so I'm not throwing Corona under the bus. The one on the right is Corona. The one on the left is a Felco, but they also make a really nice, Corona makes a nice knockoff of Felcos. So Corona does make good stuff as well. Don't use anvil, please. Pole saws and pole clips. The way people get around not getting on ladders is they get pole saws and pole clips. I will show you the worst pruning cuts in the world after someone has pruned a tree with pole pruners or pole clips or pole saws, because you just can't get the right angle. You can't make a good cut on the wood. Okay, we're not going to talk about quizzes. I'm going to close this up. You guys take 5, and I'm going to bring a bunch of trash in here, essentially. So, can I come in that door?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sweet.
I guess we'll find out.
And an alarm goes off.
Let's say
Yeah, let's not do that. Nope. The way to. I'm just going to drag a bunch of brush in. I want to. Okay. I mean, if you want to help, that'd be awesome. It's really nothing heavy. It's my truck looks like. Wait till you see what my truck looks like. I literally ratchet strapped a branch on top of my truck.